My name is Naomi Calloway. I'm 39 years old and I work as a senior urban planner for a mid-sized city government in Ohio. The kind of job where you spend your days reading zoning variances and public comment transcripts, and your evenings, if you're not careful, still thinking about them. Derek stood in the doorway of our kitchen on a Tuesday evening in March, holding his phone in one hand like it was evidence in his favor, and said the words he'd clearly rehearsed somewhere between his car and the front door. "You've been cold to me for months, Naomi, distant. Half the time I don't even feel like you're my wife anymore." I set down the dish towel I'd been folding, and I want you to understand that I set it down slowly, deliberately, the way you set something down when you've decided it isn't going to be a prop in whatever is about to happen. I didn't raise my voice. I said, "You're right, I haven't felt like your wife in a while." He blinked. That threw him. He'd walked in braced for a fight, for tears, for the version of me who apologizes first and asks questions never, the version of me our marriage had trained into existence over 9 years. He got agreement instead, and agreement, it turns out, is a much harder thing to argue with than an accusation. He didn't know that 3 weeks earlier I had sat in a lawyer's office 2 towns over, on my lunch break, still wearing my county ID badge on its lanyard, with a manila folder on my knees containing 4 years of bank statements and a printed hotel itinerary from a Marriott in Columbus he thought I had never seen. He didn't know that cold wasn't something that had happened to me, some mysterious weather system I'd been caught out in. It was something I had built on purpose, brick by brick, the way you build a wall around a house you already know you're planning to leave, quietly, methodically, so the wall is finished before anyone else even notices you've started laying the foundation. He thought he'd walked into the beginning of an argument. He didn't know he'd walked into the last 5 minutes of one that had already ended 2 years before, entirely without him. "Say something," he said, when I didn't fill the silence the way I always used to. I looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look I'd give a developer at a hearing who thought volume could substitute for a valid permit. "I already did," I said. "You just weren't listening when I said it the first time." He had no idea what I meant. That's the part that still sits strangely with me, even now, months later, how completely he had missed the exact moment his own marriage ended because he'd been so thoroughly occupied elsewhere. I watched his face cycle through confusion, then irritation, then something closer to fear, and I remember thinking, almost with detachment, that's new. He's never looked at me like that before. For 9 years, Derek Hollies had never once had a reason to be afraid of me. That night, standing in our kitchen with a dish towel folded neatly on the counter between us, he finally did. He pressed on anyway, the way people do when a script they've written in advance refuses to give way to whatever's actually happening in front of them. "I've tried, Naomi. I've really tried with you this year. You've just shut down. It's like you decided to stop being my wife a long time before I did anything wrong." That line almost made me laugh, and I want to be honest that some small, tired part of me did, quietly, internally, at the sheer audacity of a man standing in the wreckage of his own choices, trying to relocate the timeline of blame onto my face instead of his calendar. I didn't laugh out loud. I said evenly, "You're closer to the truth than you know. I did decide to stop a while ago. I just didn't decide it before you gave me a reason to." I want to tell you exactly what that kitchen looked like, because I remember it with unusual clarity, the way you remember rooms attached to the last conversation of something. The overhead light was slightly too yellow, something we'd meant to fix for 2 years and never did. There was a grocery list on the fridge, half in his handwriting, half in mine, ordinary and domestic, and already somehow evidence of a life that had quietly finished without either of us formally closing it. I remember thinking, standing there, that endings rarely look like the dramatic scenes you imagine when you're younger. Most of them look exactly like an ordinary Tuesday kitchen with the wrong light on, and somebody finally saying out loud what had already, privately, been true for a very long time. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever been the one who kept the peace so long that people mistook your silence for surrender, this story is for you. Stay to the end, because the ending isn't the one Derek was bracing for, and it isn't the one you're bracing for either. If any part of this sounds familiar, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been blamed for the exact thing someone else did to you first? Let me take you back to the fall of 2011, a housewarming party in Dayton thrown by a mutual friend from my graduate program. I was 24, 2 years out of school with a fresh master's degree in urban planning, renting a cramped one-bedroom above a dry cleaner and proud of every square foot of it, the first apartment that was entirely, unambiguously mine, chosen by no one but me, paid for by no one but me. Derek Hollies was 26, standing by the drinks table telling a story that had 6 people laughing before he'd even reached the ending. He had that kind of charm, the room-filling, effortless kind, the kind that made his mother, Carol, light up the moment he walked into any space, like he was still 8 years old and had just brought home a report card she could brag about at church. Derek had one older sister, Renata, 31 at the time, married with 2 young kids, living 20 minutes from their parents out in Kettering. Carol Hollies ran that family the way some people run a small, closely held business, with clear favorites, clearly assigned roles, and a ledger she never wrote down anywhere but never once forgot either. Derek was unmistakably the golden one. Renata was the responsible one, which in that household meant she was the one everybody called at 11 at night when something needed fixing, and rarely the one anybody thanked once it was fixed. I would learn much later, far too late to be useful to me, that I had been slotted into a role in that family before I'd even said I do. I just didn't have a name for it yet, and nobody was in a hurry to give me one. Here's a memory that tells you almost everything you need to know about how that family worked. Thanksgiving, 2012, a year into dating Derek. Carol handed me a stack of dishes after dinner. I didn't mind, genuinely. I liked being useful. I liked being invited into the kitchen instead of parked in the living room with the men watching football. But when I came back and sat down at the table, she announced to everyone loudly enough that conversation actually paused. "See, this one doesn't just sit there. She's a keeper." Derek laughed, pleased, like I'd passed some test on his behalf, some exam he hadn't studied for but was benefiting from anyway. Renata, across the table, caught my eye for half a second, and there was something in her face I didn't have language for yet. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was recognition, the particular look of someone watching a familiar trap close on somebody else. She knew precisely what had just happened to me because it had already happened to her, over and over, for 31 years running, and she had simply run out of the energy it would have taken to warn me. Second memory, our wedding, June 2014, a reception hall outside Dayton with white folding chairs and a band that played about 4 decibels too loud for the size of the room. Carol cried real tears during her toast and said into the microphone, "I finally don't have to worry about Derek anymore. Naomi's got him." 140 guests laughed warmly, glasses raised. I laughed too, in my white dress, 27 years old and genuinely happy that day, or believing myself to be. It would take me 9 more years to understand that Carol's line hadn't been a compliment about my marriage. It had been a job posting, read aloud to a room full of witnesses, and I had just been publicly hired for a position I never technically applied for, at a salary that would turn out to be entirely emotional and mostly one-directional. I want to add one more detail from the wedding itself, because it's small and it took me 9 years to understand its weight. During the reception, my own mother, Linda, pulled me aside near the gift table and said quietly, just between us, "You don't have to marry his whole family, sweetheart, just him." I laughed and told her I knew that, of course I knew that, and went back to the dance floor. My mother died 2 years later of a sudden cardiac event, before any of what I've described here had fully taken shape. And I think of that sentence of hers more often than almost anything else she ever said to me, because it turned out to be the single most accurate piece of advice I received in my entire adult life, and I didn't have the tools yet to actually use it. Third memory, smaller, but it stayed lodged in me the way small things sometimes do more than large ones. The first time Derek forgot my birthday in the spring of 2013, before we were even married. Carol called me the next morning, not Derek, Carol, and said, "Don't make a big thing of it, honey. He's under a lot of pressure at work. You're so good at not making things a big deal." I hadn't said a single word to her about it. I hadn't said a single word to anyone about it yet. Derek had already got to his mother first, already framed the story in his favor, already managed my reaction to his mistake before I'd had the chance to have one of my own. That was the pattern, running quietly underneath everything for years before I could name it. The word for it I know now is preemption. They managed how I was allowed to feel about their behavior before I ever got a turn to feel it on my own terms, in my own time, in my own words. A fourth memory belongs here too, because it explains something about Renata that matters later. At that same Thanksgiving in 2012, after the dishes, after Carol's comment, I found Renata alone on the back porch, arms crossed against the cold, staring at nothing in particular. I asked if she was okay. She said, "You'll figure this family out eventually. Just don't figure it out the hard way if you can help it." I laughed it off at the time, assumed it was ordinary in-law griping, the kind everybody's sister-in-law does at holidays. I didn't understand until years later that she had just handed me, as clearly as she was able to at the time, the only warning anyone in that house was ever going to give me. There's a fifth memory, and I include it because I think it explains Derek, not just his family, and I want to be fair to the fact that he wasn't simply born this way. The family built him this way, the same machinery that would later be turned on me. Christmas of 2013, 6 months before our wedding. Derek, 28, showed Carol a modest bonus check from his job at the time, proud of it, holding it out almost like a child holding out a drawing. Carol looked at it for a long moment and said, "That's nice, honey, but Renata's husband got a bigger one last year and nobody made a fuss about it." Derek's face fell just for a second before he laughed it off the way the whole family laughed everything off. I remember feeling a small, unexpected pang of sympathy for him in that moment, watching a grown man get quietly, casually cut down by his own mother over Christmas ham. I understand now that Derek had spent his entire life being simultaneously worshipped and starved by the same woman, praised extravagantly in public and diminished precisely in private, and that a person raised that way learns two things at once: that love is conditional and comparative, and that the way you survive it is by finding someone else to absorb the conditions on your behalf. I became that someone. I don't say this to excuse what he did. I say it because understanding the mechanism doesn't require forgiving the man who benefited from it, and I think both things can be true at once: that Derek was shaped by something ugly, and that he chose repeatedly, deliberately over 14 months to do something ugly of his own. We married in June of 2014. By September, Derek had lost his sales position at a regional auto parts distributor, not fired exactly, restructured out, in his words, a phrase he used so smoothly, so practiced, that I didn't question it for months, and by the time I did, it no longer felt like something I had standing to bring up. He was between jobs for 4 months. I covered the mortgage on the starter house we'd bought that spring, the groceries, the utilities, and $340 a month on his car loan on top of my own bills, all on a $52,000 salary from the planning department, a salary that had felt like plenty when it only had to support one person and suddenly felt like a tightrope supporting two. I remember sitting at our kitchen table in October of that year with a legal pad, doing math I hadn't expected to be doing 4 months into a marriage, and Derek walking past, glancing at the pad and saying, "You're so good at this stuff. I'd be lost without you." I remember how the compliment landed at the time: warm, flattering, proof that I mattered, that I was needed. I did not yet recognize it as the opening line of a role I would be reciting for the next 9 years. I want to be fair to that first year, though, because it wasn't only the beginning of a pattern, it was also genuinely one of the years I felt closest to Derek, in the ordinary, unglamorous way new marriages sometimes bond over shared hardship. We ate a lot of pasta that winter, the cheap kind, and watched a lot of borrowed DVDs from the library because we couldn't afford much else. And there were nights, curled up on a second-hand couch, when I felt genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, in a way I don't want to erase from this story just because I understand now what it was quietly becoming the foundation for. I think that's part of what makes patterns like this one so difficult to see from inside them. They are very rarely built entirely out of bad material. Most of the bricks are ordinary, even good. It's only the mortar holding them together that turns out, years later, to have been made of something you'd never have agreed to if you'd been asked outright. When Derek finally landed a new position that January, at a base salary lower than his last one, Carol told me over the phone warmly, like she was handing me a gift, "You handled that so gracefully, Naomi." Some wives would have made him feel like a failure the whole time. I remember thinking quietly, privately, in the part of my mind I had already started keeping separate from the part I let the family see. Some wives would have said something out loud instead of swallowing it whole. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that's simply what marriage was: you carry each other through the lean years, and the lean years pass, and then you're carried in turn. I didn't yet understand that in this particular marriage, the carrying only ever ran in one direction, and that direction was always, unfailingly, toward me. Derek's father needed a hip replacement that spring, and while the surgery itself was covered by insurance, the 6 weeks of in-home physical therapy afterward were not $2,800 out of pocket split. Carol decided over a phone call I wasn't actually part of, the way the family always splits things. Derek relayed the decision to me at dinner as though it had already been finalized, which of course it had before I ever entered the conversation. I didn't argue. I remember Derek saying, almost gently, reaching across the table to take my hand, "You get it though, right? He's my dad." And I did get it. I have never once, even now, resented helping with his father's recovery. What I noticed, and didn't say anything about, filing it instead into that separate part of my mind, was that the way the family always splits things seemed to mean, every single time without exception, that Derek and I contributed and Renata's family contributed, while Carol herself, who had a pension from 30 years as a school administrator and a paid-off house, contributed her opinion on how everyone else's money should be spent. That same autumn, I asked Derek carefully over dinner whether we might start a joint conversation with his parents about long-term planning, nothing dramatic, just the beginnings of a framework, so that the way the family always splits things might one day become something closer to a plan instead of a series of emergencies. Derek looked at me like I'd suggested something faintly embarrassing. "It's not that kind of family, nay," he said. "We just help each other when it's needed, that's it." I remember the word just doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence, minimizing something that would, over the following 7 years, cost me more than any single line item on a mortgage. Renata's second son was born that spring with a mild heart defect, not one requiring surgery, but one requiring frequent specialist monitoring, and the co-pays were adding up fast for a young family already stretched thin on a single income while Renata stayed home with the boys. Carol organized what she called the family fund, $200 a month from Derek and me, $200 from her and Derek's father, and notably nothing at all expected from Derek's cousins on his father's side, whom Carol had simply never warmed to, for reasons she never fully explained and nobody ever asked her to. I didn't mind helping Renata. I liked Renata, genuinely, in a way I didn't yet fully like anyone else in that family, including, if I'm honest with myself now looking back, Derek himself. But I noticed, and filed away without naming it yet, that the fund ran entirely through Carol's personal checking account, and no one but Carol ever saw a ledger of where the rest of it actually went. When I asked once, gently at a Sunday dinner, whether we could set up a shared spreadsheet just to track it, nothing accusatory, just practical, the kind of thing I did professionally every day, Carol said, "Naomi, we're a family, not an accounting firm," in a tone that ended the conversation before it had properly begun and drew a small, approving laugh from Derek, who I noticed did not come to my defense, not even a little. I dropped it. That was, I think now, looking back with the clarity I didn't have then, the first time I consciously chose silence over a fight I suspected I'd lose anyway. It would not be the last. A small warmth beat because it genuinely wasn't all bad yet, not obviously, not in a way you could point to and hand someone as proof. Renata called me that October out of nowhere, no occasion attached, just to check in. "You don't get thanked enough in this family," she said. "I see it. I just wanted you to know somebody sees it." I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I sat on my back steps holding the phone against my ear for a long moment after she said it, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly, the way a knot loosens when someone finally names the thing it's tied around. I just said thank you and changed the subject, the way I changed the subject on anything that touched too close to something true. I wasn't ready yet. I wouldn't be ready for 6 more years. This is the year it began, though I wouldn't understand that for 2 more years. Derek took a new position that spring, managing a regional sales territory, one that required overnight travel roughly twice a month. He was proud of the promotion, and I was proud of him too, genuinely. I remember taking him out to dinner to celebrate, at a restaurant we couldn't quite afford, because I wanted badly to be the kind of wife who celebrated her husband's wins without keeping score. I didn't know yet that keeping score was about to become the only thing that would save me. In October, he attended a 3-day conference in Columbus. I know now from a credit card statement I would eventually pull myself 2 years later that he checked into the Marriott downtown on the 11th with a colleague named Ashley Prentice and checked out 2 days later, sharing a single room charge between them. At the time, I knew none of this. What I knew, what I actually experienced in real time, living inside the marriage rather than reconstructing it from receipts, was that Derek came home from that trip warmer than he'd been in months, attentive, funny again in the old way, bringing me a bouquet of grocery store flowers for absolutely no occasion, asking about my day and actually listening to the answer. I remember being grateful. I remember thinking, lying next to him that week, maybe we're finally finding our rhythm again. Maybe the last 4 years were just the hard part every marriage goes through, and we're through it now. That's the machinery of it, and I want to name it plainly, the way I couldn't back then, because I think it's the part of this story that will land hardest for anyone who's lived a version of it. Guilt performs as romance. The nicest Derek was to me across our entire marriage tracked almost exactly with the beginning of the affair. I mistook the guilt for love because nobody had ever taught me the difference, and because I badly needed the difference not to exist. It is a strange and specific kind of grief, discovering years later that your happiest month in a marriage was actually the direct byproduct of your husband's shame. Carol's boiler broke in February, an old cast-iron unit that had been dying slowly for years, wheezing through every winter since I'd known the family. Repair estimate, $4,100. She called Derek, who called me, and within a week the money had come out of our joint savings account, money I had been quietly setting aside for 18 months, $100 here, $200 there, transferred in small unremarkable amounts so it wouldn't show up as a line item worth questioning, for a kitchen renovation I'd wanted since we bought the house in 2014. Derek said when I hesitated even slightly, "It's my mom, nay, what was I supposed to do, let her freeze?" And then the line, the one that sounded reasonable on its surface and wasn't underneath, the one I've replayed more than almost any other sentence from those 9 years. "You're so much better with money than I am. I trust you to just figure out where it comes from." That single sentence did two things at once, so smoothly I didn't catch either of them happening in real time. It flattered me, and it made me solely responsible for absorbing the shortfall his generosity toward his mother had created. I found the kitchen renovation folder sitting unsent in my email drafts 11 months later. A half-finished message to a contractor I'd never sent, and quietly deleted it without opening it, without letting myself reread even a single sentence. I told myself that was simply marriage too, that you don't get everything you plan for, that sacrifice is the currency of a shared life, that this was what for better or worse actually looked like in practice, unglamorous and financial and small. I didn't yet let myself ask the harder question underneath that. Why was the everything that kept getting sacrificed always specifically mine and never once his? A small warmth beat. That same spring, Renata drove 90 minutes each way twice to help me after minor surgery on my shoulder, refusing gas money both times, telling me, "You've covered for this family more than anyone in it. Let me cover for you just this once." I cried in her car afterward, not from the shoulder pain but from something closer to finally being seen by someone in that house, someone who noticed the imbalance without my having to point at it and beg. Renata was never part of what came later. And I want to say that clearly early, because she is one of the only people in this entire story who never once asked me for something she wasn't equally willing to give back in kind. I remember, in the passenger seat that second drive home, half joking, saying to Renata, "Sometimes I feel like I married your mother instead of your brother." Renata didn't laugh the way I expected her to. She kept her eyes on the road for a long moment and said, "You're not wrong." He learned from somewhere. It was the closest she ever came in all those years to saying anything directly critical of Derek in front of me, and I remember being a little startled by it and grateful and unwilling at the time to let myself actually absorb what she was telling me. Before I move into 2020, there's a smaller chapter that belongs here, one I almost left out because it doesn't have a dollar figure attached to it, and this whole story has trained you by now to expect one. But not every cost in that marriage showed up on a bank statement, and I think it would be dishonest to imply otherwise. That December, I asked Derek if we could spend Christmas Day just the two of us, no drive to Carol's, no dishes, no toast about how well I had him. Just us in our own house in pajamas, doing nothing in particular. He agreed at first, and I remember feeling something close to hope, the specific hope of a person who has been quietly rationing her own wants for years and is finally tentatively spending one out loud. 2 days later, he came home and said, gently, apologetically, in a voice designed to make refusal feel unreasonable, "My mom already told everyone we're coming. It'll break her heart if we back out now." I said okay. Of course I said okay. I want to be honest that I don't even remember arguing. That's how thoroughly the okay had become automatic by then, a reflex faster than thought. I spent that Christmas at Carol's table washing dishes again, and on the drive home that night, Derek reached over and squeezed my knee and said, Thanks for being so easy about it. I know how much you wanted a quiet one. He said it like a compliment. I remember staring out the passenger window at the dark, unremarkable stretch of highway between Kettering and our own driveway, and feeling, for the first time with any real clarity, a small, cold, precise thought. He knows exactly what he's asking me to give up. He's just decided it's his to spend. The affair with Ashley Prentice had continued, I would eventually learn, straight through the start of the pandemic. Remote work meant fewer overnight trips, but it also meant more unaccounted for hours, more calls that ran long, more evenings spent in the detached garage office Derek had converted that spring, ostensibly so he could take sales calls without disrupting my own work-from-home schedule. I remember thinking at the time how considerate that was of him. I remember saying so out loud to Carol on the phone. I remember her saying, "He's always thinking of you," and I remember believing her. In August, Carol asked to borrow $6,000 against the equity you two have built up in the house, to help Renata's husband cover 2 months of mortgage after he was furloughed from his warehouse job. I agreed, the way I always agreed, transferring the money the same week without a second conversation, without a repayment plan, without so much as a text confirming the amount. Derek told me that week, with real warmth in his voice, pulling me into a hug in the kitchen. "This is exactly why this family trusts you, Nay. You never make anything complicated." I didn't recognize it then, but I understand now that never making anything complicated was simply the family's private phrase for never asking a single question they didn't want answered, dressed up to sound like a virtue instead of what it actually was, which was a mechanism. I want to pause here and name that mechanism directly the way I couldn't while I was still standing inside it. That's the machinery of it. Praise, delivered at the exact moment compliance is required, functions as a leash disguised as a compliment. Every time I was told how graceful, how generous, how uncomplicated I was, it happened in the same breath as a request for money, time, or silence. I was never praised for anything that didn't cost me something. I didn't see the pattern because the pattern was itself designed to feel like love. I've thought a great deal since about why it took me so long to see it, given that I do this exact kind of pattern recognition professionally. Reading zoning applications for the small, buried clause that changes everything else in the document. I think the honest answer is that it's far easier to spot a manipulative structure in someone else's paperwork than in your own marriage, because the paperwork doesn't also hand you flowers afterward, or hold your hand at your mother's funeral, or remember, on the good days, exactly how you take your coffee. The mechanism works precisely because it's woven through with real tenderness some of the time. If it were cruel every day, I would have left years earlier. It was the good days that kept me there, not because they outweighed the bad ones on any honest ledger, but because they made the ledger itself feel like an act of disloyalty to even keep. A brief reminder, if this story is landing for you, hit subscribe now because everything I didn't know starts surfacing in the second half, and it is genuinely worth staying for. I received a promotion that year, senior planner, a $14,000 raise, the biggest single jump of my career, the result of 18 months of extra committee work I'd done almost entirely on evenings and weekends. At the celebratory dinner I remember that clearly because Derek had said his card was acting up that week, a phrase that would turn out to have a much less innocent explanation than I understood at the time. His toast included the line, delivered with a laugh so I'd know I was supposed to laugh too. "Careful, Nay, don't get too big for this family." I laughed on cue, the way you laugh at something that technically isn't a joke, because naming it as not a joke out loud would have cost more in that moment at that table than the laugh did. But something in me noted it precisely, the way I note a structural crack in an otherwise sound building, small, easy to overlook, and exactly the kind of thing that tells you everything about what's happening underneath the surface if you're willing to actually look. That night, alone in the bathroom afterward, I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I didn't cry. I just looked, the way you look at something you're starting to suspect you've been avoiding looking at directly for years. Some part of me had begun keeping a ledger of its own by then, quietly, even though I wasn't ready to open it and read it in full yet. I want to be honest that this wasn't a single dramatic turning point. It was one of maybe a dozen small moments spread across 9 years where a quieter, steadier part of me took a small step back from the marriage while the rest of me kept showing up for dinner. Before I move to 2022, I want to include one more scene from around this period, because it's the closest I came in 9 years to almost saying something out loud before I was ready to. It was a Sunday at Carol's, early spring, the dogwoods just starting to bloom in her front yard. Derek had stepped out to take a work call that ran unusually long, even for him, and I found myself alone in the kitchen with Carol, drying dishes side by side the way we had 100 times before. She said, out of nowhere, not looking at me, focused on a pot she was scrubbing, "You know, Naomi, I sometimes worry Derek doesn't tell you how much you do for this family. He's not always good at saying things out loud." I remember standing very still with the dish towel in my hands, feeling something rise in my chest that felt, for just a moment, like an opening, the first genuine crack of vulnerability I'd ever heard from Carol, unprompted, undefended. I almost said something honest in return. I almost said, "No, he isn't, and neither are you, and I've noticed both of those things for years." I had the sentence fully formed. I remember it sitting on my tongue. Instead, Carol continued before I could speak, "But that's just how men in this family are. My husband was the same way." You learn to read what they mean instead of what they say. And just like that, the opening closed again, folded neatly back into the family's oldest lesson, that the burden of interpretation, of translation, of emotional labor belonged permanently to the women in that house, and always would, and that even a moment of apparent tenderness from Carol was, in the end, another lesson in absorbing more rather than asking for less. I dried the last dish in silence. I think about that almost sentence more than I expected to, looking back. It's one of maybe 3 moments across 9 years where I came within a single breath of naming the whole pattern out loud to someone inside the family, rather than someone outside it. I didn't get there until January of this year. I sometimes wonder what might have shifted, if anything, if I had said it that afternoon instead of waiting 3 more years to say a version of it with a binder on the table instead of a dish towel in my hands. In March, I found a hotel loyalty statement folded into an old jacket pocket while doing spring cleaning, not proof of anything on its own. Just a receipt, 3 nights in a city 90 minutes from home. On dates Derek had told me he was visiting a client I later confirmed, through a casual conversation with a coworker of his at a holiday party, didn't actually exist under that name in his territory. I didn't confront him, I filed it, I mean that literally. I opened a private folder on a personal cloud drive Derek didn't have the password to, one I'd set up years earlier for old work documents and had all but forgotten about, and I placed the receipt inside it. I told myself I was being paranoid, unfair, the kind of wife who imagines things instead of trusting her husband, the kind of wife Carol had occasionally, pointedly described disapprovingly at family gatherings. Some women just can't let a man breathe. But some part of me, the quiet, competent part that this entire family had spent 8 years training to notice everything and voice almost none of it, had already, without my full conscious permission, started building a case. I didn't call it that yet. I call it that now, looking back, with something closer to respect for the version of myself who started collecting evidence before she was even willing to admit to herself that she needed any. Derek's territory expanded that year to include 2 more states, which meant travel increased to nearly every other week. I remember a specific Tuesday in June when he called from a hotel in Louisville to say goodnight, and I could hear faintly in the background a television playing a channel we didn't get on our own cable package back home, a small, meaningless detail on its own. And one I noted anyway, out of a habit I no longer questioned, the way you note the license plate of a car that cuts you off, not because you plan to do anything with the information, but because some part of you has decided it's worth keeping just in case. That same year, Carol asked for another loan, smaller this time, $1,100 for Renata's older son's orthodontia, just until tax season. I paid it, and for the first time in 9 years I quietly wrote it down, the date, the amount, the phrase, just until, in a notes app Derek never opened, tucked inside a folder labeled with an innocuous project name from my actual job, where nobody would think to look. I didn't know yet what I was building toward. I only knew I had started keeping receipts in every sense of that phrase and that some deep, patient part of me had stopped believing that just until would ever actually arrive. There's a specific evening from that year I keep returning to. Derek and I were at a work dinner for one of my colleagues, and someone at the table, a woman I didn't know well, made an offhand comment about her own husband's business trips, joking, "How do we know they're not all just seeing someone else on the side?" The table laughed. Derek laughed loudest of all, reached over and squeezed my hand under the table and said, "Not this guy. I'm exactly where I say I am every time." I remember laughing along, and I remember underneath the laugh a small, cold, precise thought arriving fully formed the way certain thoughts do. That sentence was too specific to be a joke. I didn't know yet how right that instinct was. I only knew to write the date down. I also remember, later that same year, a smaller, stranger detail that I only understood the significance of in hindsight. Derek started ironing his own shirts. 9 years into the marriage, after 9 years of leaving them for me or the dry cleaner, he suddenly, without explanation, bought a travel steamer and began pressing his own clothes before trips, carefully in front of the mirror, the way a man does when he wants to look a specific way for someone who isn't his wife. I noticed it. I filed it under the same growing category of small, wordless facts I was collecting without yet calling it collection. It's strange, looking back, how many separate, individually forgivable details it actually takes to add up to something undeniable, and how long a person can go on forgiving each one privately, one at a time, before she lets herself add them together out loud. There's a stretch of about 4 months I haven't described yet because it doesn't fit neatly into a single year, and because it's the part of this story I'm least proud of and most grateful for at the same time. After the AP initials first crossed my radar via that hotel receipt in the jacket pocket, and long before the calendar notification made everything undeniable, I went through a quiet period of what I can only honestly call research. Not confrontation, not evidence gathering in the formal binder sense yet, just looking. I found Ashley Prentice's public social media profile in October of 2023. From a work conference photo Derek had carelessly once let me see over his shoulder months earlier, a name tag visible in the corner of a group shot. It didn't take long. 2 golden retrievers, a rented townhouse 40 minutes from our own, a handful of photos from a work trip to a lake house that matched almost to the week, one of Derek's territory visits from that spring. I looked at those photos more times than I want to admit, in the bathroom at midnight with the fan running so the light wouldn't wake Derek, scrolling backward through a stranger's life looking for the exact moment my own life had quietly stopped being only mine. I want to say something honest about that period because I think it matters for anyone living through a version of it right now. It did not make me feel powerful. It made me feel small and a little unwell and deeply lonely in a way I hadn't let myself feel even during the worst of the money arguments over the years. I stopped after about 6 weeks. Not because I found peace with not knowing, I hadn't found peace with anything yet, but because I realized, scrolling through a stranger's dog photos at 1 in the morning, that this particular kind of looking wasn't going to give me what I actually needed, which wasn't more pain. It was proof, organized, dated, and useful. I closed the laptop that night and didn't open her profile again until months later, and even then, only once, briefly, the week after I filed, mostly to confirm to myself that I felt nothing, which, to my own quiet relief, I mostly did. By the start of this year, I had a folder with 11 documents in it and a low, steady hum underneath my ribs that I'd stopped calling anxiety and started, privately, calling clarity. Derek and I still had dinner together most nights. We still went to Carol's on Sundays. From the outside, and even from most of the inside, our marriage looked entirely intact, functional, even enviable. Friends still occasionally told me how lucky I was, how easy Derek and I made it look. I had gotten very, very good by then at looking intact. That is its own kind of exhausting labor, one nobody in that family ever once thanked me for, because none of them knew it was happening. I want to say something about that particular exhaustion because I don't think it gets discussed enough. There is a specific fatigue that comes not from carrying a secret but from carrying 2 lives inside one marriage at once, the visible one. Warm and functional and photographed at holidays, and the private one where you are quietly, methodically building the case for your own eventual freedom, one bank statement at a time, and telling absolutely no one because you haven't yet decided you're allowed to. There's one more incident from that stretch worth including because it's the closest thing to a near miss this story has. In November of last year, at Carol's for a birthday dinner, Derek's phone buzzed twice on the counter while he was in the bathroom, and I glanced at it out of nothing more than habit, the way you glance at any phone lighting up nearby. The preview text read in full before the screen dimmed again, "Miss you Thurs, can't wait." No name attached, just a number I didn't recognize, though I would recognize it 2 months later as belonging to Ashley Prentice. I remember standing very still in Carol's kitchen, dish towel in hand, feeling the floor tilt very slightly under something that wasn't actually moving. Carol walked in a moment later, saw my face, and asked lightly, "Everything all right?" I said yes. I said it smoothly, without hesitation, the way I'd said yes to that family for a decade. I want to be honest that I don't fully know, even now, whether that smoothness was strength or just a very old, very well-practiced kind of damage. Possibly it was both. I've stopped needing it to be only one. It happened this past January, not dramatically, not the way you'd expect after a build-up like that. Derek left his laptop open on the kitchen counter one evening while he showered, still logged into a shared family calendar we'd used for years to coordinate holidays. The same calendar Carol had insisted back in 2016 that the whole family adopt for scheduling. A notification popped up from a second, separate calendar synced to the same account, one I'd never had reason to open before, tucked one tab away from the one I actually used. An entry recurring every other Thursday labeled only AP 6:30. I sat down at the counter. I didn't touch his phone, and I want that to be clear because I think it matters. This wasn't a discovery born of snooping in the way people usually mean it. It fell into my lap the way the truth sometimes does after you've spent long enough quietly, patiently waiting for it. I typed AP into the search field of that second calendar, and 11 more entries appeared, stretching back 14 months, all in the same rhythm, same time, same interval, the particular handwriting of a habit, not an accident, not a single lapse in judgment, but a schedule maintained with the same discipline he'd never once applied to remembering my birthday. I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment. I didn't, not right away. What I felt was quieter and colder than that, the specific feeling of a door closing somewhere far off in a house you'd assumed, until that exact second, was empty, the confirmation of something you'd already, on some level, decided was true long before you had proof of it. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the counter and drank it while it was still too hot to drink comfortably, feeling the burn on my tongue and being almost grateful for a sensation sharp enough to organize my attention around. And by the time Derek came downstairs in a towel, hair still wet, asking what I felt like for dinner, I had already calmly begun making a mental list of everything I would need to gather before I said a single word to anyone at all. "Thai food," I said. "I'm thinking Thai food." He said that sounded great, toweling off his hair entirely unaware, and reached for his phone out of habit to check the delivery app, the same easy domestic motion he'd made 1,000 times before. He had no idea, standing there dripping slightly onto the hardwood in the same kitchen where months later he would accuse me of coldness, that he had just eaten his last easy dinner in that house. We ate at the kitchen table 20 minutes later, and I want to describe what that dinner was actually like, because I think it says something true about the strange, dissociative discipline that 9 years of a certain kind of marriage can train into a person. Derek talked about a coworker's retirement party. I asked follow-up questions, real ones, the kind that require actual listening, and I listened to the answers genuinely, while some entirely separate part of my mind was already 3 steps ahead, cataloging which bank 3 years of statements would be easiest to pull first, which weekend I could get to the county records office to check the title on the house, whether Priya's number was still saved under a name Derek wouldn't think to search if he ever went looking through my phone. Both of those things were true of me at once, at the same table, over the same plate of pad CU. I don't fully know even now whether that capacity is a strength or a scar. I've come to suspect it might simply be both, the way a callus is both a strength and a scar at the same time, proof of an old injury and proof that the injury no longer has the power to stop you from using the hand. That night, after Derek fell asleep, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the same ceiling I'd stared at for 9 years, and I found myself doing something I hadn't expected, counting backward, not dollar amounts, just ordinary Tuesdays. I tried to remember the last time Derek had asked me a question about my own life, not logistics, not scheduling, an actual question about how I was doing, what I wanted, what I was afraid of, and I genuinely could not locate one in recent memory. I fell asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning, not devastated, which surprised me, something closer to resolved. I didn't tell Derek what I'd found, not that week, not the next. Instead, 3 days later, I called Priya, my closest friend from grad school, who now worked as a family law paralegal 2 states away and had, over the years, become the one person I told the things I couldn't say out loud to anyone inside my own house. I told her everything in order, starting with the boiler in 2019 and ending with the calendar entry from 3 days before. She listened for a long time without interrupting, which is unusual for Priya, who has never in the 20 years I've known her let a silence sit for more than 4 seconds. When I finally finished, she said the sentence I've replayed more times than almost anything else in the last 2 years. Naomi, you've been managing this family's emergencies for 9 years. Nobody manages a family that hard unless some part of them believes they have to earn a place in it. I didn't respond right away. I sat with that on the phone in silence long enough that Priya finally said, "You still there?" And I said yes, and I meant it in more ways than one. Yes, I was still on the line, and yes, some deeper, more frightening version of that question had just landed somewhere I hadn't let it land before. "Can I ask you something, and you don't have to answer it right now," Priya said, in the careful voice she uses with clients, the one I'd only heard secondhand before. "What do you think happens to you in that family if you stop paying for things? Not Derek, the whole family. What happens to your invitation to Thanksgiving?" I remember laughing, a short, unhappy sound, because the honest answer arrived faster than I wanted it to. "I don't know," I said. "I've never tested it." "That's the answer," Priya said. "You've never tested it because some part of you already knows what the results would be and you didn't want to see them in writing." I sat with that for a long moment, the phone warm against my ear, the kitchen quiet around me. "You think they only keep me for what I do for them?" "I think," Priya said gently, "that you built 9 years of proof for a question you were too afraid to actually ask, and now you finally have the proof for a different question instead. Use it for that one." I didn't sleep well that night. I lay next to Derek, who had no idea any of this conversation had happened, breathing evenly beside me, and I ran Priya's question in a loop. "What happens to my invitation to Thanksgiving?" I realized somewhere around 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, that I had spent 9 years terrified of a question I had never once had the courage to actually put to the test. I decided, lying there in the dark, that I was finally going to test it. That sentence sat in my chest for the better part of a week, working its way loose from things I'd buried on purpose, layer by layer, the way sediment gets disturbed and rises when you finally stop treating the water as still. Because underneath the calendar entry, underneath the boiler and the $6,000 wire transfer and the kitchen renovation I'd stopped even letting myself think about, there was an older, smaller, more embarrassing fear, one I hadn't looked at directly since maybe that Thanksgiving table in 2012. If I stop being useful to this family, do they keep me? Not do they love me. I had, if I'm honest, stopped being fully certain that was even the operative question anymore, somewhere around year 6 or 7. Do they keep me? Carol's wedding toast hadn't been about love, I understood now, sitting with my tea gone cold in front of me, replaying it for the 1,000th time with new eyes. It had been about function. "Naomi's got him," she'd said, in front of 140 witnesses, and for 9 years I had worked, without ever consciously deciding to make that sentence permanently true, at real and mounting cost to myself, because some part of me had come to believe that being needed was the only currency that would guarantee I got to keep my seat at that table. I want to spend a little more time here than I have anywhere else in this story, because I think this part, the deciding, not the discovering, and definitely not the confronting, is the part almost nobody tells you the truth about. Finding out is fast. A calendar notification takes 4 seconds to read. Deciding what to do about 9 years of your own life takes considerably longer, and it is not glamorous, and it does not look from the outside like very much is happening at all. I made an appointment with a family lawyer that same week, Diane Acaffer, recommended by a coworker who'd gone through her own divorce 2 years earlier and described Diane as someone who tells you the truth even when it's not the version you called hoping to hear. I didn't go to file, not yet. I went to understand what I actually owned, what I had actually contributed over 9 years of marriage, what leaving would cost in real terms, and this was the harder number to face, harder by far than any of the dollar figures. What staying had already cost me, in currency I could finally start adding up on paper instead of carrying around unspoken, unweighed, unclaimed. Diane asked me a question in that first meeting that Priya's comment had already cracked the door open for, and it landed somewhere I wasn't fully braced for. Naomi, what do you actually want, separate from whatever keeps the peace? I sat in her office, 41 stories up from a parking garage I'd fed quarters into on my lunch break, in the same blazer I wore to zoning hearings, and I realized with a small jolt of something close to shame that I didn't have an answer ready. I had spent 9 years becoming fluent in exactly what they wanted, Derek, Carol, even in smaller, gentler ways, Renata, that I had let my own wanting go quiet the way a muscle goes quiet when you stop asking anything of it. It doesn't disappear, it just stops volunteering, it waits to be asked. Take your time, Diane said, not unkindly, sliding a legal pad across the desk toward me. Most people who sit in that chair have never once been asked that question by anyone, including themselves. You're not behind, you're just early in a different part of the process than the paperwork. I asked her, instead of answering, what the financial picture actually looked like, the house, the joint accounts, 9 years of contributions that had never once been equal in either direction. She walked me through it in plain, unhurried language, no jargon, the way I try to explain a zoning ordinance to a resident who's never had to think about one before. Ohio was an equitable distribution state, she explained, not community property. The court would divide things fairly, which did not automatically mean equally, and marital misconduct like an affair generally wouldn't move the financial needle much on its own, though it could matter for other things. Timing, custody arrangements neither of us had to worry about since we had no children, credibility if things became contested. The binder isn't primarily a legal weapon, she told me. It's clarity, for the judge, sure, eventually if it comes to that, but mostly I think for you. She was right, though I didn't fully understand how right until months later. The binder never actually needed to go before a judge. Derek didn't contest much of anything in the end. I think some part of him understood, the moment he saw it on Carol's table, that there was no version of contesting it that wouldn't cost him more than simply letting it go. The binder's real function had already been served the night I built it, tab by tab, at my own kitchen table. It had told me the truth before it ever told anyone else. I want to be honest about the fear underneath all of this, because I think the fear is the actual emotional center of what happened to me, more than the affair itself, more than the money, more even than the confrontation. It wasn't primarily a fear of being alone. I want to be clear about that, because I think people assume that's the fear, and for me it genuinely wasn't the loudest one. The loudest fear, the one that kept me up at night in that stretch after Priya's phone call, was smaller and older, and I think more specific to how I'd been raised inside that family. If I am no longer useful, do I disappear from the story entirely, or does the story simply get told without me in it, as though I was never really necessary to begin with? I sat with Diane's question, what do you actually want, separate from whatever keeps the peace, for days before I could answer it even to myself in private with no one watching. I found myself, more than once that week, drafting an apology in my head for a divorce I hadn't even filed yet, rehearsing ways to make my own leaving smaller and more comfortable for everyone else. The exact same instinct that had governed every financial decision for 9 years, now trying to govern the decision to finally stop making them. I noticed that instinct arriving, and for the first time I didn't follow it. I let it arrive and I let it pass, the way you let a wave pass over your feet without stepping back from the shoreline. I went home that evening and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, doing something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember. I made a list on the back of a parking receipt of things I actually wanted, with no audience, no family vote, no consideration of whose feelings it might manage. It was a strange, small, private list, a kitchen with better light. A dog, which Derek had always said he was allergic to. though I'd later learn from Ashley Prentice's own public social media in the strange, quiet research phase that followed, that she owned two golden retrievers he'd been photographed with, smiling, unbothered, apparently unallergic in that particular house. A job that didn't require me to also manage everyone else's job. A Sunday that belonged to no one's mother but my own choices. Reading that list back, sitting alone in a cold car in my own driveway, was the moment I actually decided, even though the paperwork wouldn't be filed for another several weeks. Not the calendar entry, not the binder, the list, because the calendar entry told me what Derek had done. The list told me, for the first time in almost a decade, what I actually wanted done about it. I kept that parking receipt. It's a strange thing to have kept, out of everything from that period, not the binder, which I gave to Diane and never asked back for, not any of the bank statements, which live now in a folder I rarely open. Just a small, curling scrap of thermal paper with a handful of items written in ballpoint pen, half of them already faded past legibility. I keep it in the drawer of my new kitchen, the one with the good light, and every so often, usually on an ordinary evening that has nothing dramatic about it at all, I open the drawer and look at it, not for sentimental reasons exactly, but as a kind of proof. The same instinct that built the binder in the first place applied now to something gentler. Proof that a version of me, sitting alone in a cold car outside a house she was about to leave, had known exactly what she wanted, long before she believed she was allowed to have it. Over the following 3 weeks, I pulled everything methodically, the way I approach a zoning file when I know it's going to be contested and I only get one clean shot at presenting it. Bank statements going back to 2018. The Marriott charge from October of that year itemized room 412, 2 nights become one shared charge. The $6,000 wired to Carol from 2020, with no repayment ever logged against it in 9 years, not once, not a single dollar. The 11 AP calendar entries, printed and dated, arranged chronologically. Text message metadata I could pull through our shared phone plan's online billing portal, not the content of the messages, just the pattern, hundreds of texts concentrated to one number, clustered tightly around the exact windows of the calendar entries, and the client visits that didn't match any client account Derek had ever mentioned to me by name in 9 years of dinner table conversation about his work. I built a binder, tab by tab, the way I'd build a case file for a contested variance. Evidence first, narrative second, conclusions last, because conclusions built ahead of the evidence are how you lose credibility with anyone actually paying attention. And I needed badly to be believed the first time without having to repeat myself, without having to perform the outrage I mostly wasn't even feeling anymore by that point. Not out of vengeance. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story as though I'd been plotting some elaborate reckoning for years. I hadn't. I was doing the same thing I had always done in that family, quietly, competently gathering what was needed to solve a problem before anyone else even fully understood there was one. The only difference, the only thing that had actually changed, the only thing that mattered, was that for the first time in 9 years, the problem I was solving belonged to me, and only me, and I intended to be the one who decided how it got solved. There was one evening during that 3-week stretch I want to describe in a little more detail, because it's the closest this whole process came to breaking me before it finished making me stronger. I was cross-referencing the calendar entries against Derek's expense reports, which I had access to through our shared cloud storage from an old joint tax filing years earlier, and I found a reimbursement for client dinner, 2 guests on a night I already had logged from the calendar as an AP evening. Seeing the 2 documents side by side, the calculated cheerfulness of an expense report next to the quiet, coded shorthand of an affair, did something to me that no single piece of evidence had managed on its own. I sat at my kitchen table and cried, finally, properly, for the first time since January, not for the marriage exactly, but for the sheer, staggering amount of careful, deliberate effort it had apparently taken Derek to maintain both lives at once, effort he had never once in 9 years spent trying to understand what I actually needed. I let myself cry for about 20 minutes. Then I made more tea and I kept working, because I had learned over 9 years in that family that grief and competence were not mutually exclusive states, and that sometimes the only way through one was to keep quietly practicing the other. I want to say something plainly here, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I did not go looking for proof in order to punish Derek. I went looking for proof because I needed, finally, at 39 years old, to see the actual shape of what had been happening to me, instead of the shape everyone around that table had spent a decade telling me it was. Being cold, Derek's word, thrown at me like an accusation in our kitchen, wasn't a flaw I owed anyone an apology for. It was, I came to understand somewhere in that third week, with the binder open on my kitchen table at midnight, a pot of tea going cold beside it, the first fully honest thing I had let myself do in years. I chose a Sunday dinner at Carol's house, the same dining table where she delivered her wedding toast 9 years earlier, the same table where the family fund had first been proposed as though it were already decided, the same table where the boiler repair had been announced to me, not discussed with me. I brought the binder in a canvas tote bag and set it on the empty chair beside me, unopened, all through the meal, through the small talk, through Carol's questions about my job and Derek's stories from his last trip, waiting until the dessert plates had been cleared and the coffee poured. Renata was there with her husband and both boys, now 11 and 13. Derek's father sat, as always, quietly at the head of the table, technically presiding over a household he had never actually run. I remember the specific weight of the tote bag against my forearm as I lifted it onto my lap. I remember thinking with a strange, calm clarity that I had carried heavier things than this into that house for 9 years, and none of them had ever once been mine to set down. Carol was mid-sentence, something about summer travel plans, a lake house she and Derek's father were considering renting in July, when I opened the tote bag and set the binder on the table, the first tab facing her and Derek both. "I want to talk about October of 2018, I said. My voice didn't shake. I had practiced that beforehand, not the words themselves, just the register, flat and factual, the exact voice I use at public zoning hearings when a developer tries to talk over a resident who's raised a legitimate objection and thinks volume alone will settle it. The Marriott in Columbus, room 412. And I want to talk about Ashley Prentice and 14 months of recurring calendar entries under her initials, and the $6,000 that left our joint savings for a boiler in 2020 and never once came back, and the kitchen I never got, because for 9 years I kept deciding this family's needs came before my own without ever once being asked whether I agreed to that arrangement." The table went silent in a way I'd never heard it go silent before, not the polite silence of someone pausing to pass the potatoes, but something closer to a held breath. Derek's face went red almost instantly, and he started talking fast, the way people do when they've never once had to build a case for their own innocence because nobody in that house had ever asked them to. "This isn't the place, Naomi. You're embarrassing yourself and you're embarrassing me in front of my family over something that isn't even." "It is exactly what it looks like," I said quietly, not raising my voice to meet his, keeping it level in a way that seemed to unsettle him more than shouting would have. "I have the statements, I have the calendar, I have 9 years of dates and dollar amounts, and none of them are open to interpretation." The dining room clock, an old brass thing Carol had inherited from her own mother and wound by hand every Sunday, ticked audibly into the silence, the way ordinary sounds sometimes become strange and loud at exactly the moments they matter least and most at the same time. I remember noticing it, the ticking, with the same detached, hyper-attentive clarity I bring to a contested public hearing, cataloging the room even as I stood inside the most personally significant conversation of my adult life, because some part of me had learned over 9 years never to fully let my guard down in that house, even now, even here, even with the binder already open on the table. Carol's hands went to her mouth, genuine shock. I want to be fair about that, not performance, at least not in that first unguarded second. I watched something cross her face before she recovered into outrage. An actual mother, for one brief moment, confronting the fact that her son had done something genuinely ugly. Something she hadn't authorized, hadn't managed, hadn't been able to smooth over in advance the way she'd smoothed over every one of his failures since he was a boy. And underneath that, something else, a woman realizing in real time in front of her whole family that the structure she had spent 3 decades constructing, the one in which Derek never had to answer for anything, had a fault line running straight through the middle of it, and I was standing directly on top of it, holding a binder that proved it. "You're doing this here," Carol finally said, her voice climbing, hand pressed flat against her chest, in front of the boys, reaching, immediately, instinctively, for the oldest tool in that family's kit, make the moment about my behavior, my timing, my choices, rather than his. The boys are old enough to hear that documentation isn't the same thing as cruelty, I said. I hadn't planned that line either. It arrived the way the strongest ones always did that evening, already fully formed, like it had been waiting 9 years for the right room to be spoken in. Derek's father, silent through most of it, finally spoke quietly, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "Derek," he said, "is this true?" And there was something almost unbearable in the fact that it took his own father in that moment, 40-some years into fatherhood, to finally ask him a question nobody had ever made him answer before. Derek didn't answer directly. He looked at the binder, then at me, then said in a smaller voice than anything he'd used all evening, "It isn't what you think it is." "I don't need it to be what I think it is," I said. "I need it to be what it is, and I already know what that is. I've known for a while, actually. I was just waiting until I didn't need to raise my voice to say it." I didn't raise my voice to match Carol's either when she tried once more, quieter this time, closer to pleading than accusation. "We can fix this as a family. That's what we do." "I know that's what you do," I said. "I've been the one doing the fixing for 9 years. I didn't spend 8 of them managing this family's emergencies so I could stay quiet about the one that finally belonged to me." Derek tried one more approach, the oldest one, the one that had worked on me for 9 years without my ever fully clocking that it was a technique rather than an emotion. He softened, his shoulders dropping, his voice losing its edge, and said, "Naomi, I know I messed up, but we built a whole life together. Doesn't that count for something? Are you really going to let one thing erase 9 years?" I looked at him for a moment before I answered, and I found to my own quiet surprise that I wasn't angry anymore, not in that instant. I was almost sad in a clean, uncomplicated way I hadn't expected to feel at that table. "It's not one thing," I said. "It's 14 months, on top of a boiler, on top of a kitchen I gave up without ever telling you I wanted it. On top of 9 years of being told how uncomplicated I was every single time I absorbed a cost that wasn't mine to absorb." "You're not asking me to forgive an affair, Derek. You're asking me to keep doing the only thing this family ever actually valued me for, which is going quiet so everyone else can stay comfortable. I'm not doing that anymore. That's the whole announcement. Everything else is just documentation." Nobody at the table had anything to say to that. Carol opened her mouth once, then closed it again, which I think may be the only time in 9 years I ever saw her decide, mid-sentence, that a thing wasn't worth saying out loud. Renata's husband, Marcus, who had said almost nothing over 9 years of family dinners beyond pleasantries about grilling and gas prices, cleared his throat and said quietly to the table generally, "For what it's worth, I've always thought Naomi handled more than her share around here." It wasn't a dramatic statement. He said it the way you'd note the weather. But I remember being oddly moved by it, precisely because it came from someone who had no reason to say anything at all, who had nothing to gain and nothing to lose either way, and had simply, apparently, been quietly keeping his own private observations for years, the way I had. The younger of the two boys, 13, broke the long silence that followed by asking, in the flat, curious voice children use when they haven't yet learned to filter a question for the room's comfort, "Are you and Uncle Derek getting divorced?" Nobody answered him right away. I did eventually, because I decided in that moment that he deserved a true answer more than the room deserved a comfortable one. "Yes," I said, "I think we are." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the directness of it, and went back to his dessert, and something in that small, matter-of-fact exchange did more to steady me than anything the adults at that table had managed all evening. Renata didn't say a single word in Derek's defense, not one, the entire time. She reached over without looking at anyone else at the table and closed her hand over mine where it rested on the closed binder. That was the whole gesture. It was, somehow, entirely enough, more than any sentence anyone else at that table managed to produce. Aftermath. I filed for divorce 11 days later. It wasn't especially dramatic on paper. Diane had already prepared most of the documentation before that Sunday dinner even happened, because some part of me had known, underneath the calm, what I was walking toward well before I consciously decided to walk there. Derek moved in with his parents temporarily, a word that quietly became permanent within about 2 months. The same house he'd been the golden one in since he was a child, absorbed back into it with something close to relief on Carol's part, as if the house itself had simply been waiting for him to fail his way back home. He tried twice to reach me through mutual friends, with messages relayed secondhand about how I'd blindsided him, how I'd been cold for years before any of this happened still. Even after everything, even with the binder still sitting, tabbed and dated in Diane's office, working the same rhetorical trick he'd always relied on, trying to make my documentation the crime and his 14 months the footnote nobody needed to dwell on. I didn't respond to either message. I had at that point said everything I needed to say and said it once clearly at a table full of witnesses, and I had no further interest in saying it again for an audience of one who still hadn't been listening the first time. Carol called me once in April not to apologize but to ask carefully in a voice that had lost none of its old warmth, as though nothing at all had shifted between us, whether the family fund arrangement for Renata's son's ongoing cardiology checkups would still be something I'd want to help with given everything. I told her no. Not unkindly, I made a point of that, of not being unkind, because I had spent 9 years being accused of coldness I hadn't earned, and I wasn't interested in finally earning the accusation on my way out the door. Just clearly the same register I'd used at her dining table. That was the last time Carol and I spoke. I want to be honest about something here because I think it's important, and because tidy stories tend to skip it. For weeks after that call, I second-guessed myself. Not about the divorce, I never once doubted that. But about the fund, about Renata's son, about whether declining to keep paying into a system that had never once been transparent with me made me the person Carol had always half implied I might become if I ever stopped being agreeable. Cold, calculating, ungenerous. I called Renata, nervous, almost apologetic, to explain my reasoning. She stopped me halfway through. "Naomi," she said, "you gave that family 9 years of yourself. You don't owe them a tenth. I never once thought that made you cold. I thought it made you finally honest about what you could actually afford to keep giving." Renata and I still talk most weeks. She sent me a message in May that I've kept, screenshotted, saved in 3 different places on my phone and my laptop, and absurdly printed out and tucked into the same binder that had held the evidence. "You were never cold. You were just done pretending the temperature in that house was fine." Her older son, now 11, asked her recently why Aunt Naomi doesn't come to Grandma Carol's house anymore, and Renata told him simply, "Because Aunt Naomi finally started keeping some things for herself." He asked if that was allowed. She told him yes. I think about that small exchange more than almost anything else in this entire story, an 11-year-old learning, a full generation earlier than I ever did, that it's allowed. I'm not going to tell you this ended in some tidy, total reconciliation, because it didn't, and I don't trust stories that claim it always does, and I think those stories do a disservice to anyone actually living through something like this and looking for an honest map instead of a fairy tale. Derek's father called me once, awkwardly, months later, from a number I didn't recognize, to say he was sorry for how everything got handled, which is about as close as that family comes to an apology and about as far as it will ever go. I thanked him for calling. I didn't pretend it fixed anything, and neither, to his credit, did he. I don't know if Carol and I will speak again. Some days I hope we will. Most days I've made a kind of peace with the possibility that we might not, and that peace didn't come from forgiving her for any of it, not fully, not yet, maybe not ever. It came from something quieter and more useful than forgiveness, no longer needing her to be sorry in order for me to be fine. I think about Carol more than I expected to in the months since, and not always with anger. I think about the version of her at that dinner table, hand pressed to her chest, genuinely, unmistakably shocked, for the length of maybe 3 full seconds, before the old instincts reasserted themselves and she went back to managing the room instead of reckoning with it. I wonder sometimes what Carol might have been in a different family with a different mother of her own, if reckoning had ever once been modeled for her as something survivable instead of something to be avoided at any cost. I don't excuse what she did or failed to do across 9 years of my life, but I've stopped needing her to be a villain in order for my own story to make sense. She was, I think, simply a woman running the only operating system she was ever given faithfully generation after generation, until a daughter-in-law with a binder finally introduced a bug she hadn't accounted for. As for Derek, the last I heard through Renata, he's still seeing Ashley Prentice, openly now, which I find I have almost no feelings about at all, which was itself a discovery. The absence of feeling arriving months after I expected it to, quietly, the way most real endings actually do, without the fireworks the story would have promised you if I'd let it. I sold the house in June, faster than expected, and used a portion of my share of the proceeds, plus, I'll admit, a modest, deliberate sum I set aside specifically because I could finally set it aside without a boiler or an orthodontist bill absorbing it first to redo a kitchen. Not the old house's kitchen. A new one in a smaller place I bought entirely on my own with better light than I'd ever had before, a detail that had sat on the back of a parking receipt for over a year before it became real. I adopted a dog in July, a mid-sized rescue mutt named Basil who turns out to be no allergy risk to anyone in my current household, on account of my current household being just the two of us. Priya visited in August and stood in my new kitchen for a long moment before saying, "This is the first room I've ever seen you stand in that looks like it was built around what you wanted instead of what everyone else needed." I didn't have a clever response to that. I just started crying, standing at my own counter in my own kitchen for the first time in longer than I could remember, and it felt strangely like relief rather than grief. I think about the version of myself who sat in Diane's office 41 floors up, unable to answer a simple question about what she wanted. I think about her more gently than I expected to. She wasn't foolish. She wasn't weak. She had simply spent 9 years inside a system engineered, patiently and without any single dramatic villain, to make her own wanting feel like an inconvenience to everyone she loved. I don't think that woman needed to be rescued from herself. I think she needed, eventually, exactly what she got, enough evidence to finally trust her own read of the room. There's a professional postscript to this that I didn't expect, and I include it because it surprised me. My work oddly got better. Not immediately, the first 2 months after the divorce filing were predictably difficult to concentrate through. But by early summer, colleagues started commenting, unprompted, that I seemed sharper in meetings, faster to push back on a bad proposal instead of quietly absorbing it, and revising it into something more palatable for everyone else in the room. My supervisor, reviewing my work that spring, said something I've thought about often. "You've always been good at this job, Naomi, but you used to negotiate like you were trying not to inconvenience anyone. Now you negotiate like you actually believe you're allowed to win." I hadn't realized, until she said it, how visible 9 years of a certain kind of training had actually been, sitting right there in my professional life the entire time, in a job that had nothing at all to do with Derek or Carol or any dinner table in Kettering. Here's what I know now, and it's the thing I wish someone had told me plainly at that Thanksgiving table back in 2012. While I sat there being praised for washing dishes nobody had actually asked me to wash, being needed by a family is not the same thing as being loved by one. I spent 9 years earning my place at that table by being useful, and it turns out you cannot purchase belonging with usefulness, because the moment you stop supplying it, you find out with total clarity exactly how much of the love was ever really about you at all. I wasn't cold, I was simply done being warm on somebody else's schedule. If you take nothing else from this story, I hope you take that line, because I think it applies to more than marriages and more than the specific family I married into. It applies to any relationship, a job, a friendship, a parent, where warmth has quietly become a fee you're expected to keep paying instead of a feeling you're actually allowed to have. Coldness, in my experience, is very rarely the disease people accuse you of having. Far more often, it's the first symptom of a person finally recovering from one. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been called cold for finally noticing the temperature, I want to hear about it. Tell me your version in the comments, whatever shape it took in your own life. Share this with someone who needs to hear that documentation isn't bitterness, it's clarity, and that keeping receipts is sometimes the most honest thing a person can do for themselves. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there are a lot more tables like that one out there, And a lot more people just now realizing they're allowed to stop setting a place for people who never once set one for them. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, keep your own receipts in every sense of that phrase. You never know which ordinary Tuesday you'll finally need them for.